Welcome and thanks for joining us for the Global Data Vault May webinar. I'm Trista Perot, Director of Marketing for Global Data Vault, and I'm not the only one who's looking forward to this in-depth conversation about how to create a DR plan. Today we're going to cover a lot of ground. When it comes to creating a DR plan, every company is different, and that means your specific details will be unique to your company. However, there are definitely some key elements that every company should consider, and we have two experts in the industry who are going to talk us through the difference between DR and a business continuity plan, and which are sometimes blurred together, and what your DR goals should be and the right methodology to use when you're creating that DR plan. We're also live streaming to both Facebook and YouTube, so I encourage you to like our pages on both of those, page and channel. With that, let me introduce a few people. So invisible but in chat, we have Brian Brignac and Leslie Ferris, both from sales for Global Data Vault. And for our speakers today, we have Kelly Colwell, who is in product marketing for Global Data Vault, and Tom May, who's our CIO. So they've had plenty of conversations around this topic, so it's fun for us to include you in those discussions in a meaningful way. So with that, let me hand it over to Kelly to get us started.
Thanks, Trista. Welcome, everybody. Tom, it's good to see you again. One of the things that Trista mentioned, disaster recovery defined. So the difference between business continuity and disaster recovery. When you think about business needs, it's important to consider from a business continuity standpoint, everything that it takes to run your business. So essential aspects goes from people, phone systems, desks, chairs, places to work, anything that people need on a day-to-day basis to continue functions for the business goes into a business continuity plan. When we think about disaster recovery, that's more on the IT side specifically, where we want to look at the systems that are required to enable business continuity, right? So the systems that are required to run the applications themselves, any IT components, whether they're brought up in the cloud or in a different location, that enable the business to run. Tom, did I do that okay?
Oh, yeah. No, you keep going. You're definitely hitting all the marks as we go.
So we have a picture from, last month's webinar where we talked about a fire in a data center, right? So that could be both a business continuity and a disaster recovery scenario where they simply have to figure out what to do. And we heard from them talking about where could they relocate servers, where could they bring up new servers, which servers in the existing facility could they move. At the same time, they're trying to figure out disaster recovery plans and talking to the people who use the facility to enable their own disaster recovery plans. And we'll talk about why that's important, why you should have your own disaster recovery plan. So the goals, obviously, it's going to be to restore operations. That's the number one goal, is to get everything back up and running. But it's very business centric. It's going to be specific to what you do. And as Trista mentioned, every business is different. Every organization is different. Some might be very service driven. There might be fewer systems that they need to bring up. Some might be very heavily where they're web-based and everything's done on the web. So it's just important to consider what your specific needs are. Tom has a lot of experience with compliance and regulatory requirements, which are very challenging at times, right, Tom?
Oh, absolutely. The compliances change. Sometimes you're under multiple compliances, and now you're interfacing in with vendors to see about their compliance and adherence to yours. So yeah, you're definitely a juggler in a circus when it comes to compliance.
Yeah, so it's just important to consider if you have specific requirements where you run today, you're going to have those where you run in a disaster, or for your, for your temporary solution, for your permanent, whatever it might be for the disaster. You need to consider those compliance and regulatory requirements that you have. And now one thing that people tend to not remember is that disaster recovery doesn't have to be just for huge disasters. It's not necessarily per site, per location. It could be per application. So if you have a specific application that your business thrives upon or is a critical element to your business, you could have specific application type disaster recovery plans. And that's something that's important to remember as well. For example, if we lost access to Veeam, to our Veeam environment, that would be an application-specific critical disaster event because we would be unable to function, as a DR, as a service provider. So it's just important to consider those applications and not just a DR as a whole. So the methodology, when you want to create a disaster recovery plan, we think about it in 5 steps. And it could be 3 for you, it could be more, right? These are basic guidelines. The first is going to be identify, define, document, test, and then revise, rinse, and repeat is likely what to say. So this is a living document, and we'll go through the next couple of slides and explain these a bit more, but you want to have some type of a beginning and an ending in mind when you're coming up with your disaster recovery plan. And Tom, what do you think? Are there anything else we're missing here?
I think that is the baseline right there. And I would say that each one of these bullet points, people don't tend to realize this isn't an individual doing it, but it's a conversation across the company. I think that's what we're going to hit in our next couple slides.
Yeah, good point. Talking about identify, personally having done this is not the most fun part. Creating plans and things isn't necessarily a fun time anyway, but it's a necessity. When you think about identify, it's literally going through every section of your business and understanding what runs what servers you have, what components you have, where they're located, who owns those applications, or who's responsible for those types of things. Even down to the types of servers, hypervisors, etc. We also want to look at applications and workloads, and that goes more into the definition section we'll talk about next. But you want to understand what makes up those application and workloads, what makes them run. And with hybrid environments today, we may have things in the cloud. We may have components on premises, physical versus virtual. So it's really important to understand how those run together. And Tom, we do something pretty special with automated builds and network configurations, but what's your view on having a network documented properly, or at least identified even?
You can never have too much documentation. First, you have to create it, but then you have to maintain it. We often find that somebody wrote a document, like 3 years ago, and ultimately nobody updated it, or they've changed MSPs or department heads, and all of a sudden you're in this catastrophe here, and what happens? You're looking at old information. So really it is the networking side. I think we'll cover that a little bit more when we get into applications and workloads and really more of the strategy side. But you're right, that's baseline, that's assets, that's the physical layer. It's just like your early days of computing. There's multiple layers that build all the way up. If I were going to nerd it up, I'd say there's 7 OSI layers. Well, we're down at layer 1 or 2 here. You can't get to layer 3 until you go through those. It's like building a house. Foundation, then you start building up. So network, that's a tricky one. Knowing what's going on and where.
Yeah, that's a great point. And nobody's ever had a situation where you document it one day and then a year later you completely change hardware vendors and you forget to update the documentation, right? That never happens.
Ever. Such a rarity.
Recovery strategy insights, this is a big thing. And, here in the Dallas area right now, we have huge thunderstorms going on outside. Surprised you can't hear them. If you can, I apologize. But when you think about recovery strategies, you want to talk about distance, right? A geographic separation. Because what can happen is if you put your disaster recovery site and your production facility in the same geographic area, they both may be down. In the instance of some of the large hurricanes that we've seen come through multiple areas of the United States, you want to make sure that your disaster recovery location is far enough away from your production facility that no single event is going to affect both. And so if you think about earthquakes or fires or snowstorms or blizzards or hurricanes or anything like that, you want to just understand how those areas are affected and what you can do to protect yourselves, right? So the cloud is a good example of a disaster recovery strategy. But again, you have to understand, right? The cloud is only somebody else's computer. Where are those computers located? Where is that data center located? Where does your data reside? It's this magical cloud thing, right? Well, if you look at some of the outages from like AWS, they have regions broken down. You get an outage in the eastern region and 3/4 of the country somehow is affected, right? So you just want to understand and make sure that you're locating things appropriately and understand that you have enough distance. And I saw, Tom, you keyed on that one. What's your experience?
Oh, yeah. Everybody loves the Sky Mall magazine. You're on an airplane somewhere. Someone in the C-suite is just going through and they find that little postcard that falls out or that page and it's go to the cloud. And they come back and they're like, we just need a cloud and it all goes away. Well, any seasoned IT professional knows, I used to joke and say, we have a cloud. And people would say, what do you mean? I'd be like, our data center, our server farm, that is a cloud. but it's just where is it located? So you're right. You're only as good as your cloud provider. So in our instance, we have people that will come out and want to tour our facilities. And they're doing some great stewardship there because they want to see, what's our generator like? Do we exercise it? Do we change the oil? Do we meet these compliances? Because if they're calling us, how horrible would it be on their worst day to call us? And then we're like, funny story, we broke.
Oops.
It's just somebody else. We deal with the same problems they do. We just tend to be more specialized, I think, because this is all we do. So, we're the home run hitters, I guess.
Yeah. And as always with the recovery strategy, the 3-2-1 rule is going to be your friend, right? 3 copies of your data, 2 different types of media, and 1 off-site. And as long as you're practicing that, I know, Tom, we talk about it a lot, but it's key. As long as you're practicing that, chances of you having a single point of failure in a location are reduced greatly, right? So just make sure that you're getting your data off-site and understanding where it's going. Shouldn't have any issues. Now, we've done the monotonous task of identifying everything, right? Tom, you and I spent a month documenting everything and crawling around, going through server racks and closets and data centers and doing whatever. And now we come back to management and we say, okay, we need to figure this out. Again, important thing to understand here is organizations have different departments, right? And those different departments have different needs and they have different critical applications or critical, business impacts, if you will. So while we're defining everything, you have to bring every department into the plan and not just let me and Tom or your IT department think that we know. So we talked about defining your locations and understanding what is an impact, natural disaster, what's prominent in specific areas of the country. When I worked for a large bank, we used to have a 250-mile distance between disaster recovery sites, between production and DR sites. And those things, it was just a live site where we did replication or whatever. Between 250 miles was the minimum. So it's important if you do something like that, if you have a data center in Florida and a data center in the Washington, D.C. area, what are the 2 differences in disasters that could happen to those areas? And then what constitutes a disaster, right? So Tom, is it, hey, our tier 1 application's down. Hey, I don't have power for an hour. Hey, I got a call from the internet company and they're going to be taking circuits offline for 6 hours. What do you think about those?
It comes down to a couple bullet points down. You said business impact analysis. I mean, once you know that, you can really answer what those impacts are, is what you've described. But really, it's all of them. I suppose if I'm a billing company, for example, and so I'm doing some sort of QuickBooks invoicing or payroll, maybe 6 hours down on the internet is not the end of the world. Great. But what if I'm a web-based payroll company? Well, that pretty much impacts us a greater impact in there. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, there's so many different things. And it's funny, you've said, you don't like planning and whatnot. And I'm the operational guy on the other side going, I love planning. This is great. I feel like the A team. I love it when a plan comes together, those sorts of things. So it's a little more fun on my side, but you're always kind of going plan A to plan B to C to D to Z, so absolutely.
Yeah. Don't get me wrong. I like planning. I don't like all of the finding all 473 things that go line by line.
Yeah.
That's the part that gets me. But I love a plan. Absolutely. You can ask my wife. She won't go on vacation with me unless I have one. But another critical piece is when we talk about tiers for application. Going back to the business impact analysis and the identification part. So one example we use, you just said, was like a billing company, right? So let's say your business is billing and you have a web front end for that. There's going to be some systems that run that web front end, and that's what they do. There's going to be probably a middle layer that interacts with whatever the customer is putting in and, specific fields or checking this if they've entered this, gathering the information, conglomerating and presenting it back up to the web layer. And at the bottom end of that, you're going to have a database. Stores all the customer information, everything related to their billing history, their payments, et cetera. So you've got 3 components of a single application. And this is a very small example. It could be 20. For large organizations, you could have clustered multiple instances of web servers or web farms, and the same for the rest of the layers. But you have to understand exactly what those are and group them together so that when you go to do a disaster recovery or a failover of some type, you're not bringing up 2 of the 3 components and then missing your SLA or having extended outages because the database isn't there, right? Something like that. So as you rank these in a dollars and cents tier amount, high impact, low impact, is it how much does it affect customers? How much does it affect our bottom line? How much does it affect employee productivity? That's something that some people don't think about a lot. But if you've got 1,000 employees sitting around who can't work, is that critical to you, or that's something that you have to define? And then, Tom, we love RTOs and RPOs for each application. What are your thoughts on customers defining those and understanding that?
Well, it really goes down to the impact and understanding the systems. It's so key of what you said, identifying the systems. And I know some of our viewers today, they're sitting back going, but every server I have is important. Global Data Vault, I'm going to take every server and I'm going to put it in the top tier, RTO, RPO, because everything I do is important. I need almost continuous backup. That's fine and dandy. But there's other moving pieces in this machine. Let's pretend for a moment I had 800 servers and I turned them all on and I executed perfectly through the auto magic that is GDV. And I say, here is your network. Who's going to QC that? What stakeholder is going to be in there? You can't throw 800 at somebody and say, get it done. What you need to do is exactly what you said. Tier 1, this system relates to these different 4 component systems. Let's bring them up. Tier 2 may use some of those shared resources. All right, we'll go through. It's not even just a what am I protecting, but how am I bringing into service my systems? And I think that's where people miss it. They go, I'm just going to buy Veeam and it's done. There's so much more to this to really execute the plan. And that's the key thing is RTO, RPO. It's not just at what point in time do I come up? How long does it take to come up? But from a business standpoint, which are the right ones to bring up first? So it's those 3 real, and I don't know a cool acronym to say which are the ones I should bring up first. Business impact, business intelligence. I don't know. Somebody should coin that.
Well, maybe you could just call it a failover plan. So that's the next topic is a failover plan, exactly what Tom just described. Have a plan, define based on tier, by department, based on business needs. Have a plan of what comes up first, in what order, and make sure that you communicate that with everybody. So like Tom said, you're not sitting around trying to figure out of 800 systems, which ones are up. You systematically can go through and make the best use of the time to get all your things back up and running, which leads into response operation. Who's going to keep an eye on all of this stuff, right? From a business standpoint, and I'm not talking from our standpoint, we know what we're doing, keeping an eye on everything, right? From a business standpoint, if you have 10 different departments with 10 different applications and 20 people in each department all scrambling to try to recover things, who's going to communicate with each other? Who's going to communicate up the line? Because it's important to have a single point of communication, a single voice. If you have a crowd of people and everybody's talking all at once, and there's one person trying to get an update from this crowd of people, it's not really going to be too productive, right? You need one person who's in charge of doing that. So you want to have response operations, which would include crisis communications. I think in the document section, I'm going to talk about checklists, but this is the person that's going to be responsible to check off. These tier 1 systems are up. They have been checked. They have been QC'd. They are running. Move to tier 2 for our department, or we will wait until all the rest of the tier 1 applications for the other departments are up. And then we will continue, right? So execution of that failover plan and then talking about it. And then always, Tom, I know you want to be in communication with the customer as well. So that's a great person, another great key position to have enabled.
Absolutely. I mean, in the ITIL world, we talk about incident commanders and bridges and roles. Mm-hmm. And you're saying checklists. We've talked about this so many times about every time a pilot sits in that seat, they might have flown 3,000 times. They will still complete that same checklist because safety measures, right? It's the same thing with this failover plan, response operations. You hit it so on. Well, I know accounting needs to, or I know infrastructure. No, sequentially check it off so that you're done. That's so important here. And having the predefined communication plan. Who is running the bridge? Often we find there are multiple command centers in a response. Sometimes there's your C-suite basically looking at the business logistics side saying, when can we get out there and do what we need to do? And then you have your IT team bringing up what needs to happen, and you're traversing both. So if you predefine who's your point between and you lay this all out, a simple flow chart, will save just headaches. Flowchart, checklist, go. The first time I ever mentioned checklist, mentioned about your experience with flying. So, I mean, are you just sitting in that plane and just going, I'm going to run a single check through them all? I mean, for real, like, what does a checklist mean to you as a guy that's so into flying and whatnot?
Yeah, and it's funny that you say that. It happens at every stage of flight, right? And especially in something as complex as a passenger airliner, I have so many systems and so many people's lives, in the hands of those pilots. They have checklists for everything at every stage of flight. Even the guys who are on their last flight have been flying for 40 years, 45 years. As they're coming down landing on their very final flight, they're going through that same exact checklist they've done thousands and thousands of times again, because you just don't risk it. But that's a great segue into our documentation section. We have a failover plan scenario. I forgot about this. Yeah. So when you're in your failover plan, you want to think about how things are going to work, right? And you mentioned flowcharts and those types of things. So what we have here is just basic, a normal protected environment. Nothing's going on, right? We're just enacting our 3-2-1 rule, and we've added that separate one as a gap copy. So for Global Data Vault, that gap copy is going to be what we call enhanced data protection. Right. So on the customer side, you have your production infrastructure, which is backing up to a local repository. We go local repository because that's going to be your most common, fastest, most recently used copy of data in a non-disaster environment. 99 times out of 100, that's going to be where you restore from. When you get your backups locally, then we're going to take those and copy them up into the cloud. So now we have two different types of media there, right? Your production copy, your backup copy. By adding the offsite, then we've added the third copy. So 3 copies, 2 different types of media, 1 offsite. And then we have the gap copy, which for us it's not air gap, it's a near gap, right? We have a proprietary system that we use, that we developed, that separates the enhanced data protection data from the cloud repository. Users cannot access the data from within the cloud repository, cannot access it. We block that off, right? And we've talked about that in other webinars, and we have some information on our website. So let's think about what happens if we lose something in our primary infrastructure, like our production environment. And it doesn't have to be the whole environment. It could be a single component, right, Tom? We talked about what happens on a per application basis, or maybe it's one site out of 5 sites that you have. Can you talk me through this slide and this image and what it means for a customer from our perspective?
Oh, absolutely. And I love this slide because this is hilarious. You now convince your CFO to make this purchase to come to the cloud. Well, inevitably, they want their money's worth. So the slide is blipped. The CFO goes, go to the cloud. That's the wrong execution. And this slide shows it the best. We lose our production infrastructure. Our primary goal is to be located as close to the source failure as possible. In this particular example, we are going to use that local base. So it's the left side of that slide there, backup infrastructure, local repository, to recover those into the production infrastructure. Typically here, we've had a loss of storage. We've had a blade go down. It's just some component or multiple components. However, we can recover them back because we have a good local copy one, and it's a quick bring it up as an instant recovery, move it into production. It's a minimal downtime for our customers. And that's where we want to start, because when we look at that continuity plan, remember, it's not just how quickly do I fail over, but it's also how do I fail back. And this achieves both objectives, fail over and fail back so quickly. So everything is contained on the customer side. Great RTO, great RPO, minimal user impact, and IT dabs the sweat off their forehead and goes about their business so easily.
All right, so we're up in the ante now. And we'll talk about like a production site disaster. What happens when we lose that local or access to it, right? What happens if something causes us to lose access to both our production and our local backup copy?
Well, in this case, thank God you're in the cloud. And thank God you didn't just say, oh, I'll do some file level protection, right? Well, my files are up there. I'll just go get my Word documents back. You were smart enough to build a continuity plan that said application aware, if you will. All right, we've got to produce wherever. So at this point, boom, we're going to go ahead and we're going to say Global Data Vault, make it happen. I'm going to cast my spell using all my magic technology, and I'm going to present to the customer a fully functioning infrastructure in the cloud with the appropriate public and private access to keep their business going. It'll meet their RTO, their RPO, and it'll be running on my iron and my data center somewhere. That's option one. Option two, restore from the cloud. What a place you don't want to be, right? I'm assuming that this model was I'll just stick it in some repository and let me drag it down. Well, that's really awesome until you have to bring down 20 terabytes worth of data, or even 5. Great, you get it. Now you have to recover it. You have to build it. And, there's experts to help. We help in this scenario. But your gold is option one. You make the phone call. We bring it all up. It's network. It's public. It's private. Applications are running. They're QC'd. That's why you came off site. This is one of your worst days when you've enacted that. But boy, are you keeping your job because you kept your business running. So excellent in that scenario.
Let's make it worse then. We have ransomware or malware now, and it has impacted our production environment, the backup environment locally, and your cloud repository, because we know that these malware programs are going out and encrypting or corrupting backup files no matter where they are, right? So what do we do now?
Well, good thing you had that extra -1 in there. You came to Global Data Vault and we said, you know what? You just need it. You're going to use it because this is the number one scenario we get called on, guys. It's not I lost power in my building. It's not I lost something and some vendor couldn't provide a part. This isn't I just want to go to the cloud. This is you were infected. You had an insider threat. They impersonated you. They found your cloud repository through your Veeam console or your other provider. They nuked it all. You're done.
And now you're in the news.
Yeah, exactly. I always call that the CNBC moment. And I go to our staff and I'm like, I do not want to go on CNBC and explain why I am dumb over something. So when I get enhanced data protection, this is the phone call to Global Data Vault. This is your near gap. We are able to recover this data safely and bring it up into the cloud to, again, provide the protected public and private cloud with the appropriate access from gapped copies. This is amazing for 2 reasons. It was recovered, but it continues to be gapped to some level. Sometimes we'll bring somebody up and they actually bring up the attack vector that was used to get them. So what are we able to do? When they come up and they're infected again and they catch it, they're able to step that back, clean it, we can recover again and go. That gap, that will save your life. That is the best insurance you can ever have.
Right. And that is so critical to businesses. We talked about a failover plan. You mentioned a diagram. This is a great way that, you can utilize understanding and give that to anybody, right? So here's basically a diagram of what's going to happen for certain instances, right? Certain outages or whatnot. And here's what you have to show. So this is great for executives, great for audit, great for people who don't understand the process. This should be a part of your documentation as well, which we're now going to get into instead of me going into it earlier. Documentation, right? So everything that we've done so far has been documentation. When you identify things, your asset list, whatnot, you're documenting. When you're defining things, you're documenting. Because Tom, you and I can talk about it all day long, but when it comes to remembering it later, if we don't have it written down, it doesn't matter, right? You want to remember things. We might have somebody on the bridge. We might have an outage manager. We might have somebody else working through this document. So when you document things, make sure you're not using acronyms or words that are jargon, that are familiar to you or your team, even interdepartmentally, right? Make sure you're speaking to the lowest level of people who might need to understand what it is you're trying to say, because it very well could be somebody assisting you in that who's not hands-on, who's simply managing a checklist, who doesn't understand the ins and outs, but they can work through the checklist and know the systems based on what you tell them. Another thing is vendor contact information as well as contractors. So, Tom, let's say I'm brand new and I don't have the extensive contact list or knowledge that you do for people within the company or outside of the company. I haven't had time to build up all these contacts in my phone. And, there's an outage. I don't have access to the corporate directory anymore. So it's very important to say, hey, Kelly, our Veeam support contact information is this. Our person's name is this. Here's this person's name, email, and phone number. Here's our server hardware, our storage hardware, support numbers, and contact information. Here's contractors that we've recently hired. Here's what they do. That type of information is really important, right?
No, it is. And I think of this, we had a customer years ago, And he was just the epicenter of IT at his organization. He was their go-to guy. And he put a great plan in place. He did all of the right things. And then he never took vacations, but one time he finally hit like his 35th anniversary and he took a cruise and it was amazing for him. Unfortunately, when he came back, he was no longer employed because he didn't put those encryption keys. He didn't put those contacts, and whoever had to execute had nothing. And they found out as much as they were planned, they were out for 10 days because of exactly what you're saying. Improper documentation. I love store off site. Right? We were joking through our run through. You come up with this great plan and then you store it on the server. Great. The server goes down. Where do you go? You've got to have that break glass scenario. Is it encrypted USB key? Is it secondary location? It's like those little things get you those gotcha moments.
Yeah, and it could be, give it to your DRaaS provider, make sure they have a copy. But if you wanted to go one step further, send it to like a OneDrive or, put it on a USB drive and put it in a safe deposit box. Just make sure that you're updating those things appropriately, right? But just make sure you have copies of it somewhere else. And by providing a copy to your DRaaS provider, that's also going to help your recovery, right? This is part of your failover plan, part of your network configurations, everything that we've already done. You're passing that information along. And again, why I mentioned it's important to be very basic on your verbiage and your explanations and not use acronyms that are unfamiliar to people is because it could be your DRaaS provider who's going through this. So just remember with your documentation, be as thorough as you can, include everything, even if you don't think that you need it. Serial numbers might be helpful, right? License keys, etc. Just make sure that you're documenting everything. And next is test, right? Again, we practice. So you want to use the flying thing again. Well, I can study how to fly. I can study the fundamentals of how to fly a plane. But if I don't test it, if I don't go test my knowledge, how do I know if I can do it? Flying a plane around in the air is very much different than actually landing the plane. And I'm going to land this plane by going into the testing section. So it's critical to do this quarterly, annually, whatever makes sense for your business, right? And maybe you do it departmentally. Maybe it's different needs for different departments. Maybe it's whenever you have a new critical application or, you get around to the end of the year. Some people don't have much processing going on. Maybe you look at doing some one-off DR plans then. I know that we do this a lot, Tom, but what have you seen from a testing perspective and what maybe scares you if you think about people not testing?
Well, not testing. Like you said, you don't know if you can get that plane in the air. I think there's a second level of scariness here. It's the person who tests and doesn't find a problem in their test. Maybe I'm just the pessimist in the world, but when somebody comes back and they go, it worked wonderfully, I'm always like, did you test it? Did you really beat up on it? Now, things that we expect to work. We expect your networking to work. We expect your IOPS to be working. It might need a tweak, but you know what eats us all the time, like what gets our breakfast, if you will, like Windows patching. We bring them up in the proper sequential orders. One server has a patch that was sitting there waiting to deploy. It hangs. The systems don't time properly.
Yep.
Little things like that, cached queries. So what I like to hear feedback from a test. If you're not getting feedback from the test, I don't believe you accurately executed the test.
Yeah. And maybe, to your point, we get so ingrained with the things that we interact with on a daily basis that we become sort of blind to any issues. So it might be good to have other people test it, right? Give it to somebody else to test who doesn't do this day in and day out, because they're going to go, oh, hey, is that error supposed to be there? Does this thing normally come up like this? Is this supposed to be this slow, or are we missing something? Right? Or, hey, you were documenting your recovery plan or your failover plan, and there seems to be a step missing because as I was actually doing this, it didn't match. And you and I, as doing this every day, just our brain skipped over it, right? So having that other peer review is important.
Well, and I like that because I wanted to touch upon that during your information gather, your checklist, your document, even down to refine all of it here. One of the most powerful things I've ever learned doing this is as I write something, let somebody else execute it. If they refine it, let me then go through. So it's almost along the lines of find the most untechnological person in your environment and give them this run book to say, execute this in your scenario. Can they find those right contacts, Kelly? Can they go and find that number for Global Data Vault? Or are you saying things like go to the CRM and look under Vendors tab and find Global Data Vault? And this person has never really been in the CRM there because they have an admin assistant. It should be clearly documented where to get. Maybe it should just be in that book. Those are your greatest sources of information because they don't do it. But every one of these steps, utilizing a resource like that, is so critical to making sure you get it right.
Yeah, and that's a good point because once you do find those issues, it's not the end of the world. That's why it's a test. It's a bad thing if you're actually finding issues during the actual enactment of your plan. So once you find those issues, then you take the time to go back and refine the steps, refine the documentation, refine whatever it is that you need. And especially, Tom, if you and I are on a call list and I leave the company, who does what if the documentation is out of date? So frequent updates for employee turnover, MACDs as we call it, which is a move, add, change, delete. Anytime systems come and go, we decommission systems all the time. If we leave those in the production state in our documentation, it's only going to confuse people and potentially increase the time it takes to get the rest of the systems that are still there back up. So once you revise that, then you repeat the DR plan review. And Tom, I know that we have a lot of emphasis on documentation and plans and things at Global Data Vault. Do you have any other words of advice about this step?
Remember, they're living documents. We as human beings to have checklists. We've talked about it today. So I check it and it's done. A documentation is not a single check mark. It is a living document. It is a living being. It needs nurturing and care and feeding and watering. That's the importance. So if you can help bring your day-to-day operations into your documentation, you cut that bell curve of knowledge, kind of getting back to KCS principles, the knowledge-centric systems. What we want to make sure we do is, as I'm decommissioning a system, it should be part of my process to change that documentation. Nobody has time to go back and document it. They say they will, but they won't. And you gave a great example. I've been on at least 4 different major outages where we were working with a customer to bring up the system before somebody said, hey, we don't even use that anymore because it doesn't work. And you're just like, you've lost 4 hours. And it's not us. They're up. Maybe it's just not communicating. They thought it was firewall rules. Documentation would save such a headache in those situations.
Yeah, and again, like you mentioned, the guy on the cruise, people are trying to do stuff and they can't ask him, is this supposed to be running? We can't find it. It's in the documentation. What do you do?
Yeah.
I mean, potentially, if talk about regulatory things, it could be something that reports to and I'm going far out on example here, right? But it could be a system that reports to the SEC about trades. And people don't think about it, but it's always there and it's always working. And you stop reporting about your trades, well, guess what? Here come the fines. Here come the issues. Here comes the legalese, right? So that's a great example. And you can't stress that enough just to make sure that you keep your systems up to date everywhere.
We had somebody who had an incident one time and they gave us kudos and they were like, because you helped us out, so many jobs were saved. Have we really thought about it that way? Like, look around the building of the people you work with and say, by executing this properly, I'm making sure that these people have jobs, that their families have all their, food and necessity and lifestyles. There's so much riding on this, even just beyond the cold-hearted business side, the humanity side here. It really is so important.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that is the end of the topics. Moving into a little bit about what we do. Obviously, as we've talked about it, we are backup as a service DRAS, O365 backup provider, fully managed. So when you think about as a service, that's us. We put the service in the as a service. We support VMware Hyper-V and AHV, which is Nutanix Acropolis, and physical servers and endpoints, right?
So that was great, you guys. I have a few questions that we regularly get that I thought I'd throw in there. And we also have a question in chat. And if anybody else has a question, go ahead and throw it in chat. We'll also address those as well. From chat, we have, when will your Veeam environment be upgraded to version 11?
Great. I'll go ahead and feed that one since it kind of falls under me. So we've been working with Veeam 11 for months, even in development. If you were an existing customer, you did get a nice little video blog from me saying, hey, let's not go there yet. So the challenges with Veeam 11 ultimately come down to changes in the chaining of data. They used to offer different methods to do things. And we always used what they called a forever forward incremental. And that has thus been retired in V11. The impact that we see is not only to sizing of backups for existing customers. So you have on-prem storage issues, you have off-site changes to your budgets, but also to the chaining and integrity of the data. And we're working to understand those impacts right now. But if you've been out in the Veeam community, you've seen that there was a major cumulative release in the last week or so covering major bugs. Well, that's why we were slow to adopt. Equally so, we are still seeing reported bugs out there because we're in the Veeam development community as well. When I weigh why we need Veeam 11 as a cloud service provider, there aren't a lot of options that were offered in Veeam 11 that a majority of our customers would need. If you're looking for CDP protection, that's on-prem Veeam 11, not coming to us just yet. When we look at our protective standards and we weigh out why the -1 and extra -1 and 321 are weighted, it's more important to have a offsite cloud and a containerized near-gap solution because of those insider threats. So we have to make sure we can maintain those over, say, an on-site CDP. Beyond there, there's some features for AWS and Azure, which are nice add-on features. They're not a high adopted. I did have one customer ask me about the security and concern about going from 10A to 11. And the fact is the same security exists in both products. So right now, we're continuing to work with internal Veeam. We're continuing to work with our own development. Our Vanguard is very active in the community, trying to come up with some of the fixes. It's just not ready yet, unfortunately. So Veeam is actually staged on all of our servers. We just need to flip the switch. But we are your last best hope, as they say. Again, not ready. If I had to have a guesstimate, I would put us into the mid to late June by the time we execute over there. So that's kind of the roadmap in there. If you are facing some challenges with Veeam 11 and you're saying, hey, I really need this feature set, I suggest you talk to sales. We often find people are imagining the way that Veeam should work, and we're able to provide a better solution with the existing technology. So that's kind of the Veeam 11 topic, and I'll hand it back to you, Trista.
Well, I have one question real quick. I just want to make sure that Mark got a communication. If you're a customer already, did you receive a communication about the upgrade? Or if you're not, would you like to receive communications about that? We just want to make sure that you're on that email chain so that you know when we're ready to go, that we can get you ready too. Oh, thanks, Leslie.
Okay, we have another question in chat from Trisha. Can you explain GAP again? And is it part of the package or is there an additional cost for that?
All right, GAP. So in our world, we call that enhanced data protection. What this means is you will write backups locally to your Veeam server, and then usually a second copy lives there as well. And we take a third copy to the cloud, which seems to be a very, very safe place to be because it's off-prem. The challenge you have is when a insider threat happens. This will be when somebody is either a disgruntled employee or more often than not, you've been compromised on your network and somebody's looking to perform a ransom. They need to seek out all backups. When you're within the Veeam engine or really most any backup provider, your console for backing up has access to read, write, and remove these backups. So what will happen is as an insider comes in, what they'll do is delete local copies. They'll reach out to the cloud and delete those and then begin an encryption process. You are now ransomed. You have no data. So with enhanced data protection, we have the ability to take copies of your cloud backups and move them outside of a touchable point. And we containerize those. So there's 5 full chains in there. What will happen now is no matter how you are penetrated, or even if the Veeam cloud was penetrated through another means, they cannot touch this data. So it's almost like you took a copy home with you, which is why it is so important. And that is the number one call we get on it. And Kelly's put in a great link to the chat. Now, I'll step back from the pricing standpoint, but I believe we include that. But let me kick that over to the sales team.
Yeah, they unfortunately can't respond on this, but like Leslie said, EDP is included in any quote that we send. One interesting thing about EDP, Enhanced Data Protection, it's based on Veeam's Insider Protection, which basically creates a hidden recycle bin that when you write something to a repository, it's automatically written when it's deleted or, something happens to it that way, it gets put in this hidden recycle bin or this hidden area. What that causes challenge-wise for customers is it basically doubles the amount of disk space that you need because you have both copies of that data right there, right? So when other cloud providers say, yeah, we use insider protection, but here's your charge for it because you need, 1.5 or 2 times the amount of storage that you require normally, we don't do that. We developed some intellectual property that allows us to maintain those copies at a much lower footprint and with a small upcharge, nothing like, what those storage costs might be. We include that in the quote. So anytime that you get a quote from us, it's going to include enhanced data protection. There's no additional storage costs that come with it, and you're good to go.
Yeah, and the reason we include that, honestly, is if you don't have something like that, forget your backups. They're going to fail. You've just bought something you'll never use. And so it's very hard to talk to somebody and say, just spend a little bit more. Equally so, it's really hard being on the phone in your worst day to say, well, had you just bought that, you wouldn't be at the end of your life right now, technologically wise. So it is so important for us. And if any of those people were wondering what the storage impact is, so on insider protection with Veeam, it's going to be about a 400% storage increase because you have to increase the number of full backups to bring the chain resiliency. With our technology, we're able to take 5 full copies of the entire chain, not just the deleted files, every single one for a 20% increase. So that's why it's included with your quote. It's pretty amazing. I see Trace has a question there. Do you want me to grab that one real quick of how do we know if we have the gap protection in there?
Go ahead and jump on that.
Great. So Trace, what you would do is because you are an existing customer, I believe, if you're the famous Trace I'm thinking of, when you log into your customer portal, there is a section for enhanced data protection, and it will show you all of the copies you have, and it will show you the full chain. So it's a read only. So there's no execution you can do, but you'll see by job number 1, days 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 with dates. Click into the day, and you'll see the full chains listed in there. The other easier way is talk to your salesperson. They'll let you know as well.
Okay, next question. I know you guys get this one all the time. Does Global Data Vault have a DR plan?
Do we have a DR plan? We have to have a DR plan. I think there was a time in my life when they let me work on servers. Now all I do is actually work on security audit reviews. And that is the number one question. What is your DR plan? What if something goes down? And Veeam themselves even wanted to do a case study on us. I started the preparations for that because, interestingly enough, as a Veeam service provider, guess what? We use Veeam to have a DR plan. We also make sure we have a documentation of who we have to call and where. We have multiple locations. We incorporate in the customer side into the plan. Believe it or not, in Veeam 321, you are part of the plan. If I were to go down, you have another copy of it. I have another copy of it. So yes, it is quite robust. We built our business around disasters. And it's interesting enough when a pandemic hits and you realize, oh my gosh, we can't work where we used to. What will we do? Well, the good news is we planned for that. So we were already ahead of the curve with video bridges and phones, and we enacted our disaster plan like, COVID hour 1, minute 1, if you will. So yes, we have a robust plan that we document and we keep in place to make sure operations work anywhere, any place, anytime, as I like to say.
Awesome. So you walk the talk. Question number 3, you mentioned stakeholders, I think, Tom, earlier in the presentation. How do you identify those and who should they include?
So there's 2 levels of stakeholders, right? There's the person on paper that says, I own this system. I am in charge of accounting. And that's a wonderfully smart person with a lot of responsibilities who sometimes never sits at the console and does the work. So stakeholder with a plural S would be the person at the console who does the day-to-day job. So I would recommend a departmental meeting around a system. Hey, we have a website. Who does what around here? What areas are there? And then don't bring 50 people to the table. Maybe find your, I'm going to date myself, your power user and let them be your stakeholder with the manager. So when you have meetings, you have the managerial understanding and then the actual user understanding when it comes to stakeholders.
I think this other question is in relation to our DR plan. Pasquale is asking if they can have a copy of it.
Well, and I was going to ask Pasquale for a clarification here. Are we asking, can I have a copy of what Global Data Vault does in an emergency? or are we asking for a boilerplate to help build your own? Trista and Kelly, you guys are prepared with the boilerplates and all sorts of information in there. For the Global Data Vault plan, that is a very tricky one. We typically do not give out copies of it, only because of a security standpoint. So when we go ahead and do our operations, what I would say is, if you are going to want to be a pure diehard DR plan person, you want to make sure you're not just relying on me and my operation. So how would I mitigate that? I don't know how you take 3211 to the next level, but you might do something like implement Veeam 321 to one data center and implement 321 Veeam to a second global data vault data center. And then you are standalone and independent from us completely, because you will have your copy, and then ours gapped. And I don't know, what is that, like 7394-2? I mean, I don't know. I don't know those numbers.
Yeah, it might be easy to come up with something like a generic, here's what we do if we have an issue in one data center, right? Here's how we bring up systems in another data center, without going too much into security things, something very generic, but it's going to look very similar to what we've talked about today. Do I have data here? Does it need to be here? And then we go through our checklist, our tiering. What do we bring up first? And again, that's going to depend on all of our customers. Who's going to yell the loudest? No, I'm kidding. It's a business impact analysis that we do with our customers, or that Tom does with his team, to understand what needs to come up and when, because we can bring up 800 servers at a time and then let the customers figure out, from there what needs to happen on their end. But with those types of incidents, we want that to be seamless for our customers if possible, and have that data ready for them no matter where it resides. So like Tom said, it does become tricky. We might be able to put some very generic things together for you, and take a look at the template when we send it out, and maybe that'll answer enough of the questions for you that you're like, oh, okay, I get it, and I can just put it together myself.
And sales can help with this too. We often get the question of, well, how do I know that you'll be up? And that's where they'll walk you through. We're in tier 3 certified data centers. We use BGP. We have A side, B side power. We have the basics in place. The actual detailed execution, when we say plan, I think it would scare you how detailed we are when it comes to our plan. That is just so internal to us. But you're right, from a high level operational, we do get that during the vendor selection process. We're in an NDA, we bring the high level so people understand, okay, but really let's turn it back to the customer. What is your business requirement and how do you build it best? That's what we want to look at. And then we can fill in those blanks for you.
And the other thing is, while we don't necessarily create DR plans for folks, we know a lot of consultants who are very skilled at creating those and making sure everything is available to them. So we can also put them in touch with somebody who could actually, walk through every single step of it with them if they needed to. Okay, we've got 2 more questions. One is, as a service provider, how do you keep track of our critical information?
I have lots of Post-it notes on my monitors you all can't see here. No, we actually have a configuration database. When we bring in customers online, we have a custom written program that we use. It's a lot of intellectual property. And what it will do, it will go ahead and take a look at server names and IPs and CPU and whatnot, and it will bring it in there. So when we execute and build, it's automated. So as long as we have that information populated from the customer, we can move forward. That's really the easiest way to keep track of it, is we are database gurus. And by we, I mean smart people that work for me and not me. Don't direct your database questions to me.
Not me. Also, we keep track of what you send us. So we're only as good as our source, right? If you change things on your environment and you don't tell us, we want to keep track of that. So we do have internal databases like Tom was saying, but we also have the ability to maintain your DR plans so that we can pull those up should we need to.
And the reality of DR providing, believe it or not, to get a better RTO, or how quickly can you get back, it does come down to that data that you're asking about. But in the emergency, as long as we're built, as long as those servers are on, at that point with the right credentialing, networks can change, IPs can change, systems can go. I call it the cooks in the kitchen situation. You're using spices, you're cooking to bring about this network. How quickly do we get the network there? Comes down to your documentation. So the challenge is the spin up, and that's where Veeam has been revolutionary in our business. When I first started with the other technology, it was always a nail-biting experience. Will this server turn on remotely? Will it build? that anxiety is gone. Now it's cooks in the kitchen. Can we automate how quickly go? Did we do that shopping list beforehand? Or are we shopping on the fly while we cook? Both work. Which one's more efficient?
Okay, last question, unless anybody throws any into chat, is how would a DR plan for an MSP differ from one that's for an end user company?
Yeah, so I want to make clear or be clear that we're talking about somebody who is a managed service provider and not maybe a disaster recovery as a service provider, because I think we just addressed that. So if somebody is providing other services to customers and they're sort of in the middle of all of their IT happenings, right? I think that is very similar to what we've just discussed. So they have to look at, okay, if Trista's company goes down, do we have a contact with Trista's company to be the IT support, to be the hands-on, to help them do this, to carry servers around, to order new equipment? Are we interacting or interfacing with Global Data Vault to, bring on that as a service part of it to get their help? So I think it again is going to be very customer specific, and you might have customers as an MSP who don't want all of that help, and you do other things for them. You might have customers that are like, yes, do everything for me. I'm going to call you. So your documentation is going to be very different. But much as we've talked about today, how things need to be addressed by department, an MSP could consider every one of their customers as a department, and they need to handle those appropriately with the documentation, the processes, the definitions for each one, and make sure that you're in agreement with that person, with that company, the decision makers there. And everybody has your call trees. Everybody knows who to call. And again, right, it just all comes down to the documentation and processes that you put in place beforehand. Did that answer the question well enough?
You did. And I'm going to piggyback on and say compliancy in here. Yeah. You referenced each one of their endpoint customers. Remember, as we get into a more controlled, compliant environment, many times your customers are going to ask, like we were today, what is your DR plan? How many MSPs do they bring their endpoint customers and they don't take care of their own business? They just think, well, our people are the business. Well, what if you fail and your customer fails and you need that continuity document? Where did it live? So you need to make sure you're doing your own housekeeping, your own compliances. So when you're asked in that security review, do you do this? You can say yes, because if not, you could lose that white whale of a customer because you just didn't take care of your own procedures. Even if you're great at bringing it back up, documented, executed, planned, revised, those 5 steps we went through, you need to do that as well.
Yeah, and let's think about it real quick. I know that we're running low on time, but what if you're an MSP, and I'm using Texas, right, because that's where I live. Let's say you're in the Houston area, and you have customers in the Houston area, and a huge hurricane comes in. We had Hurricane Harvey a few years ago that covered the city in water. What if you're responsible for 5 or 6 customers that were impacted, and you yourselves have to implement your disaster recovery plan because nobody can go to work? Nobody has access to the things that they were doing. If you saw pictures of the HP campus in Northwest Houston, there was like 12 feet of water in the lobby of one of the buildings. And I'm not exaggerating. It was ridiculous. So it's important when you develop those plans to assume the worst case at all times. Assume that you are in the middle of a crisis. Assume that nobody can do anything. Then what do you do? And when you get down to that level, then you know that you're going to be able to help your customers responsibly.
Okay, well, I think that wraps it up for today. So it was a really great conversation, you guys. We appreciate everybody's time. Again, we will be sending out some checklist and guide and whatnot, some tools for you by the end of the week that cover the topic of how to put your DR plan together. I encourage you to check out globaldatavault.com/webinars for some of our past webinars that we've done. And also you can register there to be notified of future webinars. And I would not be a good director of marketing if I did not ask you to please like and follow us on Facebook and YouTube, where we are also streaming this. So thank you so much for your time, and we will see you next month.